Good afternoon and Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Muhammad Zishan Aslam and I am your host today. This session will be on the topic The Loss of Hindustan, the Invention of India. To discuss it, we have Manan Ahmed from Columbia University, USA, with Usman Qasmi from LUMS. Thank you.
बहुत शुक्रिया और तमाम लोगों का शुक्रिया जो इस पैनल में शरीक होने के लिए यहाँ पर मौजूद हैं। मैं प्रोफेसर मनान अहमद का एक तफसीली तारुफ़ करवाना चाहूँगा। मनान अहमद एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर is a historian of South Asia, is based at Columbia University, and his areas of specialization include intellectual history of South and Southeast Asia, critical philosophy of history, colonial and anti-colonial thought. He is interested in how modern and pre-modern historical narratives create understandings of places, communities, and intellectual genealogies for their readers. इसके अलावा इनकी जो पहली किताब A Book of Conquest, Chachnama and Muslim Origins in South Asia, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2016, which is about an early 13th century Persian history, Chachnama, how it describes the conquest of Sindh by Muhammad bin Qasim, and how it was received and how it sort of created this whole narrative of Islam's arrival in South Asia. His second monograph, जो आज हम discuss करेंगे, The Loss of Hindustan, the Invention of India. This is the book. और ये किताब, the good thing about, among many other things, is that it's now available in Pakistan. Folio Books has published a very beautiful, affordable edition, and you can purchase it from a bookstall here. बहुत शुक्रिया Manan for agreeing to do this panel discussion. So before we start, there's a description of the book. I can read this out, which I think, in my opinion, is a very good summary of the argument. This book is intended as a simultaneous history of Hindustan as a concept and its erasure, a genealogy of political thought that persisted and that seems to have vanished without a trace. It does require a lexical shift from secondary sources to archives and an analytical shift from origins to belonging. In forming an intellectual geography of Hindustan, historians created a corpus of thought intricately involved with the production of history. This historiography was a distinct tradition in itself. In these histories written from the 9th century to 17th century, we find rich accounts featuring protagonists and antagonists, violence, and descriptions of power and grandeur. A remarkable feature of these histories is that they are self-consciously written for future historians. We also find a carefully crafted philosophy of history and get a sense of the role of the ethical historian in telling the past. So I thought that this is a very revealing passage about the whole argument, the whole structure of the book, and now it's up to you to simplify that and explain what it means.
बहुत शुक्रिया अली. Thank you so much. And आप सबका आने का बहुत शुक्रिया. So I guess I can start with the last sentence जो अली ने अभी पढ़ा है. And the question is about philosophy of history. And the reason I think it's an important place to start is कि जो तारीख़ निगारी का फ़लसफ़ा है, जिसकी बुनियाद ये है कि अगर कुछ होता है हमारी दुनिया में at a बुनियादी सतह पे, materialist सतह पे, तो उसकी क्या वजह है और उस वजह की वजह से क्या नतीजा या का इंजाम हासिल हो सकता है. And for a long time, history was tied intimately to some idea of the sacred, some divine idea that organized why things happened. Why did something good or something bad occurred in the world? And the historians of the pre-Enlightenment period were generally understood to worry about how to narrate the intention of the divine in the matters of everyday human beings. This begins to shift in the 18th century, 18वीं सदी के mid से, and the shift happens with a series of works that come out in England, in France, in Germany, by philosophers and by historians who basically say that things that happen in this world are materially related to ideas and concepts of this world. They don't have a divine reason to happen. And so we need to figure out how to understand what takes place. It's a revolutionary idea, almost as revolutionary as Newtonian physics. And this idea, the kind of main protagonists is ufkar ke are Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, a student of Immanuel Kant, Johann Herder, and then later on the most popular version of this is created by Hegel. So I started with this idea that if an idea of universal history or of an idea of philosophy of history comes into being at a very particular moment in Europe, in Paris, in Berlin, in Königsberg, at the same time that the colonial states are engaged in material conquest in Bengal, in Madras, in Haiti, what is the relationship between those two things? And what I discovered, 5-6 साल पहले की बात है, कि एक particular तारीख थी फारसी की, जिसको एक बंगाल इन्फेंट्री के मेजर अलेक्जेंडर डाउ ने कलकत्ता से लिया और उसको वो लंदन लेके गए. He was a Scottish, part of the Scottish middle class, made his money by going with the East India Company. Very close friend of a number of philosophers, including Hume. He takes that Farsi ki us tarikh ko and he renders it, he translates it into English, and that becomes the History of Hindustan by Alexander Dow. That is published in in the early part of the middle part of the 1760s, in the 18th Sadi mein. That work is taken up by Voltaire and is taken up by Kant, that particular work, in order for them to create this theory, this philosophy of history. So at the first instance, जब मैंने इस किताब के बारे में सोचना शुरू किया था, तो I was simply trying to see how the colonial world is at the root of Enlightenment itself. It's not an aftermath of Enlightenment. Enlightenment doesn't come and then colonization happen. But that colonial world is at a foundational moment in which Europe is trying to make sense not just of the world, but of themselves, of their own history, of their own subjectivity. So that's where the book starts. The question then happens is, am I going to write another book about Kant and Voltaire? And if I do a philosophy of history, would this become a book about European thought and colonial history writing? कोई इसमें खैर बुरी बात तो नहीं है, but it's also not something that I wanted to pursue as an intellectual. And so the effort of this book is to produce something that I call a decolonial philosophy of history. It's to unearth foundational ideas, but not to say that those ideas are foundational to European thought, and now we must find our own ideas and build their foundations separate from European thought, but rather to decolonize that European thought and show the ways in which these ideas are heavily imbricated. They are in a very complex give and take. So this book is basically a way to think about philosophy of history. Why do people write history? But it takes as its genesis this moment in which Europe decides that it knows more than anyone else what universal history looks like. And what I try to do in the book is to give you a glimpse of a historian, Muhammad Qasim Farishta, jo Dakkan mein hai, who is himself pre-Voltaire writing a universal history in the early part of the 17th century. And that universal history is the main focus of this book.
I think for
मतलब was simple enough.
yeah, मैं सिर्फ ये चाह रहा हूँ कि for further clarity कि जो मोहम्मद कासिम फरिश्ता की जो वर्ल्ड है और जो टेक्स्ट है तारीख़ फ़रिश्ता, उसको अगर मज़ीद हम contextualize कर सकें, like what's the context in which it was produced and what is the world of Mohammad Qasim Farishta, the man who's writing this universal history.
So I think एक बात से हम शुरू करेंगे कि the idea कि हम तारीख़ लिखें अपने शहर की या अपनी कौम की या अपने कबीले की is an idea that really kind of takes hold in the nation state. The nation state says, I, that is the plural nation state, I have the capacity and the right to history. So we write the history of the nation, we write the history of people in nation, families in nations, whatever the case may be. And that nation for Muslim communities has always more largely been defined as ummah. So one way of writing the history of a place is to write the history of Islam, because the two become Qawm, Mulk, Sultanate, as you were just saying, become synonyms. So how do we think of something like Farishta? Who is Farishta? Farishta एक diplomat है. He's a medical practice. He's what we would now call field surgeon. He is used on he works on the battlefield to heal people who have wounded. He writes an amazing medical textbook in which he says, you know, अगर तलवार से आपकी आधी गर्दन कट चुकी है, अगर बाकी नहीं कटी तो आप कैसे उसको heal करें? And apparently he does it with some bamboo and some other stuff. Hard to believe. He's employed by Adil Shah II, Sultan of the Bijapur in the Deccan. और इस वक्त the Mughals are the major political party. Vijayanagar is more or less in decline. So this isn't a person who is employed at, like, you know, the top of the political and the cultural food chain. He's in a very small principality in the middle of the subcontinent, and he is himself not a historian. There is, however, a model for the last 30-40 years under Akbar onwards, universal histories, तारीख नवीसी के ऊपर बहुत ज़्यादा attention दी जा रही है. So Nizamuddin, Akbar's own biographer, Abul Fazl, a number of people have written kind of massive histories. They've written histories of two types. They've written histories of families of kings, or they've written histories of individual rulers, like Akbar or the Mughals or Umayyads or wherever the case may be. Farishta says these things are incomplete. अगर आप एक शख्स के बारे में तारीख लिखते हैं तो वो एक शख्स की तारीख है, उसको फिर एक्सट्रापोलेट करना बहुत मुश्किल है. अगर आप एक ख़ानदान के बारे में तारीख लिखते हैं तो वो सिर्फ एक ख़ानदान की तारीख होती है, जिसको फिर आपका स्पेस के साथ, पॉलिटिकल स्पेस के साथ उसका ताल्लुक शो करना डिफ़िकल्ट होता है. So the innovation that Farishta does is he says that the actual place, जो space जिसकी हम तारीख लिख सकते हैं और लिखनी चाहिए है, वो शख्स नहीं है, शख्सियत नहीं है, और वो ख़ानदान नहीं है, वो है space itself, Hindustan. So this is the first history written in the early 17th century. That is not a history of a family, it's not a history of a person, it's the history of a region, of a subcontinent. And he's very clear that this is the entire subcontinent. So Kabul se Bengal, Himalaya se Kanyakumari. This is the entire subcontinent. This isn't a claim to political ownership. His ruler, who's commissioning this, doesn't claim to be the ruler of Hindustan. That would be the Mughal Badshah, जो Shahanshah Hindustan hai. So this is not a claim of political rulership. It's neither is it a claim of having a divine sanction. He's not saying that the ruling elite that he's writing for has some right to govern, even if they don't govern. No. He's very clear that he wants to tell you a history of a place that belongs to him and that he belongs to. This Hindustan, Farishta's Hindustan, is a place in time, in space, and in politics simultaneously. It's not a space that is Muslim or Hindu or Jain, as in it's not only for any particular community. It's not a place that has one specific language, Farsi, ya Sanskrit, ya Telugu, ya Tamil. It's not a space that has one idea of a king, one type of a king. So, जब फरिश्ता 17वीं सदी के शुरू में इस project को लेता है, so the reason I was so fascinated by it, that he is faced with, let's just call one of the largest projects of knowledge making that has ever been undertaken by a single human being. That's Abul Fazl's History of Akbar, Akbarnama. This is a massive, massive, massive project. Done at the height of the Mughal power at the Mughal court. So there is no kind of resources that anyone in the Deccan can throw to match what Abul Fazl has already done. Similar projects are being done in the Safavid court, similar projects are being done in the Ottoman court. So Farishta understands that he can't do the type of work that these major political parties, political polities are doing. What he wants to do is to shift the terrain. He wants to say, it is not the Shahanshahiyat of Akbar, it is the specialness, the uniqueness of a place called Hindustan. And so he organizes his history as a counterclockwise movement. Ghazni and Lahore, Sindh, Malabar, all the way across the subcontinent. And for each space, he gives a history, he gives its social conditions, he gives the ways in which political and religious and economic forces are at play. And he does that very, very systematically from the earliest recorded times to his present. So the book ends with the confrontation of the Portuguese, the French, then the Germans in Surat. And the book ends with Farishta saying, I understand that these Farangis are not here to be traders. They are here to conquer us. He's very clear about that. And he knows that it's the job of the Mughal king to resist, and the Mughal king is not resisting. So in a way, this text, this history, looks forward to the colonization that is going to happen over the course of the 18th century. And he's writing this in 1610, in the beginning of the 17th century. So that's the kind of overall.
Okay, so एक जो concept I think which is very important, and you talk about it in the book, which is like the peculiar nature of the way in which Farishta makes sense of the place and the people, right? Hindustan and Hindustani people, and also the distinct kind of historical method and the archive. So when you talk about the archive spoke to Farishta, and so like how is it? What is that concept of archive? I'm very curious about that. And also, when you because I wanted to compare it with the more colonial historiographies, which you later on mentioned, where you say that it's they sort of like how they extrapolate different kinds of facts, and in that process of extrapolation of factual knowledge, it's not a process of translation. It's kind of like changes the meaning of the text altogether, right? So in a way, what is that idea of archive and fact in the pre-colonial or pre-modern method of historical writing that you're trying to sort of retrieve or comment on?
Shukriya. I mean, इस सवाल को I think we should take it on इसके दो हिस्से. Let's just let me just finish the thought about Farishta. So this is a person who says, okay, I'm going to write a history that isn't done the way history writing is done generally speaking, in his present. So what does he do? What he does is that he collects all of the histories that he can get his hand on physically. He travels from place to place, from library to library. And he says, what history do you have? Please give it to me. Some people allow him to read them. Some people say, nahi, aap nahi dekh sakte. My favorite is in Malwa, where he has to get the librarian drunk and have him pass out. And then while he's passed out, he starts to, take the notes of the history that he wants to read. At another place, he has to bribe a person to copy notes. So this is, he builds his archive step by step. Now, it's necessary because he's not writing a history of a family. He's not writing a history of a particular political party or political elite that he can be in one place and have that work being done. He is writing a history of a space. And so in order to get at the various physical spaces where there are libraries and archives in which histories have accumulated, memoirs have accumulated, objects have accumulated, that he wants to kind of study. Second, he is explicit that he's a member of something called a historian, of some profession, guild, thing. Obviously, that's not his day job. He's a diplomat. He basically takes a daughter to get married to the Mughal court. So he's arranging kind of matrimonial relationships. He's, as I said, he's a field surgeon. He's not employed as a historian. Very few people in the early modern or the pre-modern world had the designation of a historian. Those things existed, but the people that we read nowadays did not have those designations. Abul Fazl was the chief minister. He wasn't the chief historian. Nizamuddin Ahmed was a governor. So most of the people whose histories we read now weren't employed as historians, nor was Farishta. But Farishta understood himself, imagined himself as a mu'arrikh, and imagine himself having a methodology. And part of that methodology was to read other historians, cite them, and to go to particular libraries and particular archives. Something happens that aap sabko pata hai, which is colonialism begins in the subcontinent. And one of the first thing the colonial powers, the East India Company does, is that it goes for the archives, it goes for the libraries, because it has to know what it is that it is conquering. So the project of learning Persian, learning Sanskrit, of taking libraries is the earliest colonial project. It's before all of the major military defeats happen after this project. The earliest colonial project is the project of amassing knowledge. And that part of amassing knowledge happens by tracing the very same libraries that Farishta went to and getting a hold of them, taking them to London, taking them to Berlin, taking them to Paris. Now, once this project of extraction happens, and begins to happen in the last end of 17th century and throughout the 18th and the 19th century, once this project of extraction happens, how do you read those texts? Not how do you learn Farsi or Sanskrit or whatever, but how do you kind of make meaning out of it? The same thing that Farishta was doing. And this is where the colonial state says, in order for us to use this set of histories that are sitting in front of them, we have to convert them into actionable fact. We need to know how much did the state charge for taxation during the rainy seasons in the plateau versus how much did they charge during the non-rainy season in the mountains. We need to know what the ranks are of people who get to give orders and what are the ranks are of the people who get to take orders. We need to know the caste system. We need to know economy, public life, private life. So all of the mass of social data that is being created by historians since 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries is taken by the colonial officers, military officers. They're all military officers. They also are known, have the title of historians either, and converted into actionable charts, facts. That process is the process that enables the colonial state to then create laws, to create economies, to do the process of extraction from the knowledge base that they have already accumulated. Farishta both, I think, allows us to see a practice of reading that happens before colonial rule, but also, I think, personally, as a historian myself, it allows us to change the way we do history even now in our contemporary moment. Our own practices of history writing are tied to the utility that we think history has to give us. Why should we read a book? Anyways, why should we read a book? But why should we read a book of history? It's supposed to give us some factoid. Muhammad bin Qasim was the first citizen of Pakistan. Okay, well, we can get that fact from a book of history. If that fact is not available, we don't have a reason to turn to that part of our past for whatever other reasons.
Okay, so some of the things in the text, जैसे आपने किताब में भी लिखा कि it's perhaps, I think that the first historical text जो कि starts from the time of Mahabharata, right? So in that sense, it's a different kind of, of a temporal sort of idea that Farishta has, and it's more inclusive, and But at the same time, going through तारीख़ फ़रिश्ता, जब आप उसमें महमूद गज़नवी का अहवाल अगर पढ़ते हैं, सो जो ज़्यादातर सोमनाथ के हवाले से जो पॉपुलर हिस्ट्री में जो कंसेप्शंस हैं, बट दैट दे आर ऑल्सो डिराइव्ड फ्रॉम फरिश्ता, राइट? सो हाउ डू यू एक्सप्लेन दैट काइंड ऑफ लाइक?
Again, I think it's important to know a little bit about history writing. देखें, जब तारीख़ निगारी शुरू होती है तो उसका सबसे पहला सवाल है कि हम कहाँ से शुरू करें, और उसके दो काइंड ऑफ फॉर्मल जवाब आते हैं. पहला सवाल तो है कि लेट्स बिगिन हिस्ट्री विद द फाउंडेशन ऑफ हिस्ट्री इटसेल्फ, दैट इज़ टू से फ्रॉम द क्रिएशन ऑफ द वर्ल्ड. तो जो अब्बासी पीरियड के हिस्टोरियंस थे, अरब मौरख थे, they began the histories, Tabari वगैरह, they began their history writing by basically starting with Hazrat Adam, right? So first person created. That's the beginning of time, beginning of history, and then you kind of go in a manner that's called genealogical or tabakat, but stages, and you go all the way to your present. So you're beginning at a particular moment by a creation story, and you go all the way. The Byzantine and Eastern Roman kind of ecclesiastical histories begin with the flood. The flood in which the world is reset. So either you begin with the creation of the first person, or you begin when all of universal history basically gets reset. The flood destroys everything, and now new time can begin. अगर आप मुसलमान मौरख थे 17वीं सदी के अंदर, तो आपके पास दो बुनियादी चीज़ें थीं जिनसे आपने तारीख़ को शुरू करना था. आप या हज़रत आदम से शुरू करें, या आप जिस शख्स पे आप हिस्ट्री लिख रहे हैं, फॉर एग्ज़ाम्पल जलालुद्दीन मोहम्मद अकबर, उस शख्स की फैमिली के बिगिनिंग से आप शुरू करें. सो आप ज़हीरुद्दीन बाबर से शुरू करें. सो ईदर यू बिगिन विद द earliest of the person that you're writing, or you begin with the time. Farishta doesn't do either of those things. He's writing a history of a place. So he says, okay, what's the earliest account of this place, this Hindustan? And that earliest account, he says, mustanad tarikh jiski hai, wo hai Mahabharat mein. Because Mahabharat gives you the foundation of the place. So he begins there, which is both a gesture of inclusivity, but also a gesture of a dialogue. It's not that he thinks the Mahabharata is correct versus the Quran is incorrect. He thinks that Mahabharata has the same type of an origin story that the Quran gives you. And in fact, if we read the Mahabharata, he feels that the origin story explains the world as much as the Quranic origin story explains the world. So he uses this beautiful way in which he kind of posits how long is the duration since the beginning of time. How long has it been that the world has existed? And he's able to extrapolate the cyclical time, Kal Yug, Mahayug, from Mahabharata, and tie it to the time of what we can call Quranic time in Quran. And I find this very significant that Farishta, as a putative Muslim, writing for a Muslim court, is explicitly making sure that the chronology of people who live in Hindustan meet at a mythical kind of space. Everyone who lives in Hindustan, whether Hindu or non, belongs to the same mythical origin. You don't say कि भाई इन लोगों के लिए हमने महाभारत से टाइम शुरू करना है और इन लोगों के लिए हमने कुरान से टाइम शुरू करना है. So with that idea in mind, when he kind of goes through time and he gets to someone like Ghaznavi, who is known as a destroyer of temples, destroyer of Somnath, a champion of religion for one set of people, and a destroyer of religion for another set of people. So this is something that has happened, 500 years before Farishta is writing, right? He's not an eyewitness account to it. So what does he do? Well, he says, okay, let's go step by step and say, why would a political ruler do A, B, or C? Destroy something, not destroy something, leave something in a third space, in a third framework, right? So what are the reasons to do it? And he uses basically the sources that he has to present to you the three options for Ghaznavi, and then shows you how Ghaznavi chooses to destroy the idol in Somnath. And so far, this is kind of this, यानी कि ये 13वीं सदी के भी historians ने यही लिखा है. So he's not off the historical charts. But then something really sort of important happens. After this whole thing is over, he says कि हाँ भाई गज़नवी आया था, इसने सोमनाथ पे हमला किया, इसने सारे पैसे लिए और चीज़ें तोड़ी और वापस चला गया. Farishta says, what kind of a man does that? When one of the options is that if you do this, you will cause harm to the raya, to the common people. This is not about Islam. This is about everyday human beings. If you destroy this temple, everyone in the locality will suffer. So Farishta, as a historian, says, what do we make of a political leader that chooses to do an act that is destructive to the people? So he gives you in the text his own judgment of Ghaznavi. And the story of Farishta becomes actually, I mean, अगर आप लोगों ने नय्यर मसूद या इस तरह के पढ़ी हैं short stories, the end of Ghaznavi, where he is surrounded by all of his treasures. And he knows finally he's going to die and he's not going to be able to take all of this. This is a story for Alexander. This is a story for many world conquerors. That story originates from Farishta's description of Ghaznavi, where Ghaznavi is alone, bereft, and knows he's messed up. And I think that's really, really powerful, because the reader of this story in Farishta gets 3 different versions and gets the historian saying that what happened 500 years ago actually wasn't correct, as in a moral sense. It wasn't correct. Not it wasn't correct as in it didn't happen.
Okay, so I think we have a fairly good kind of like an understanding of Farishta's world. So a little bit more about like the transformation. So जिस तरह आप किताब में बात करते हैं कि जो colonizer है, उसका जो essential task है कि वो colonized को उस ज़बान से महरूम कर देता है या उस idiom से महरूम कर देता है कि जिसमें वो अपने आप को express कर सके या अपनी तारीख को लिख सके. So in a way, I mean, so when you talk about, you know, कि वो archive remove हो गई या वो Paris, London, Berlin चली गई, but is that all, you know? There's another reason, there's another kind of like a process which is happening in the 19th century, whereby, you know, the emerging new history writing in India is receptive to the idea of this new historiography, which is colonial historiography, right? So I mean, a little bit more about that process of reception, and also like, was there at the same time a parallel kind of a vernacular, quote unquote, vernacular historiography, which in a way continued with that earlier tradition or not?
बहुत अहम सवाल है, और ये बेसिकली किताब का सवाल है कि जब हम इस लफ्ज़ को सुनते हैं, समझते हैं आजकल हिंदुस्तान, हम सब को उस लफ्ज़ के साथ एक बहुत पर्टिकुलर रिलेशनशिप है. हम उसको समझते हैं कि ये लफ्ज़ इंडिया का उर्दू में उसका तर्जुमा है हिंदुस्तान, वो जगह जहाँ हिंदू रहते हैं. हिंदू जो एक मज़हब या एक सलीके के पायंदा हैं. जब सईद अहमद ख़ान फ़ंड रेजिंग कर रहे थे अपने MAO कॉलेज के लिए और उन्होंने लाहौर आना था, तो उनका जो सफ़रनामा है उसमें वो लिखते हैं कि भाई हम कभी हिंदुस्तान से बाहर नहीं गए थे, हम हिंदुस्तान से कभी बाहर नहीं गए, तो अब हम लाहौर जा रहे हैं, पता नहीं क्या होगा वहाँ पे, कैसे लोग होंगे, पंजाबियों को क्या है. वो ठीक है, उनकी पंजाब क्रिटिसिज्म इज़ करेक्ट, बट by the 19th century, the idea that Hindustan had any trans-subcontinental approach was already over. It wasn't part of everyday parlance. Hindustan एक बहुत limited spatial category थी by the end of the 19th century. Unlike for Farishta, where it's everywhere. So how did that happen? How did we become part of Hindustan as a very limited spatial and religious category from where Farishta was sitting in the early part of the 17th century? And part of what I show in the book is how Europe, not just Britain, not just Britannia, but Europe creates something called India. India didn't exist. India comes into being in the 17th century as Hindustan begins to be erased. Right? So when this invention of India happens, that India belongs to one religion in the colonial imagination, European colonial imagination. I'm not talking about Britain alone. And that religion is Hinduism, as Hinduism itself is being constructed. That India has one language for its history, Sanskrit. Has one register, the Chola bronze. To this day, you go to the Met and you want to go see, you know, a British Museum or the Louvre, wherever you want to go. If you want to see Indian art, it will not have any Muslim in it. Muslim art will be in Mughal, It won't be Indian. It will be in the Islamic gallery. That process where Hindustan as an idea is cut and reduced to one religion and one people and one Brahminical system is something that takes place over the course of the 18th and 19th century. And it's internalized by those who are colonized. This isn't कि ये सिर्फ colonial rule के अंदर, colonialism के अंदर उन लोगों की सोच है. नहीं, हमारी सोच, जो colonized हो गए, हमारी सोच है. हम भी इसी बात के ऊपर यकीन करते हैं, starting in the late 19th century, that Hindustan हिंदुओं का है, वहाँ है, और मुसलमान इस idea से बाहर हैं. By the 1910s, 20s, by the time Iqbal begins to write, by the time Jinnah says that there are two civilizations and they have never intersected with each other, all of this is received wisdom. All of this is correct. When Savarkar says that Hindustan is the place of Hindus, Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan, इस फॉर्मूले को क्रिएट करने में by the early part of the 20th century, this is not a invention of that moment. It already 100 years worth of effort has been done, and which I try to show in my book. And so the idea of Hindustan has to be erased in order for the idea of India to be constructed. And the idea of India that is constructed is the idea that we inherit after partition. Pakistan, India, and then Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. And that's the political language. And the reason I call this political forgetting is that hamare se, as a culture and a society, we lost Persian, we lost access to any of the archives that we could connect with. We lost any continuity with the past. We rejected it. It has nothing to do with, I mean, I don't even have to go back to the 17th century. If you just think about Lahore as a city of Sikhs, or if you think about Lahore as a city of Hindus, two appellation that this city proudly held for a longer period of time than the 75 years since 1947. That is the loss. That's the political forgetting that I wanted to kind of underline.
Okay, I think एक आखिरी सवाल और फिर ऑडियंस से भी हम सवाल अभी हो जाए, फिर आखिर में ऑडियंस. जी, okay. So वो there is, Indian Constitution, as you know, says India that is Bharat, right? So वो India that is Hindustan नहीं कहते. ये भारत कहाँ से आया, एक तो ये सवाल है. और दूसरा ये है कि जैसे कि आपकी अपनी जो, is it like you were prompted to write this book in the, because of what is happening around you, right? So जिस तरह कासिम फरिश्ता का एक historical context था, इस तरह मनान अहमद का भी एक historical context है. So how important that context is in this book, basically.
So there's a small section in the book when I talk about Nehru and the Constituent Assembly debates जब ये लिखा जा रहा है, sentence India that is Bharat, जो जिसके अंदर there is a opposition from Muslim MPs and there is a argument that Bharat is more inclusive because it includes Muslims, where Hindustan does not, right? So that's the logic. I think why this book is important. I mean, मेरी जो पहली किताब थी वो छाछनामा के बारे में थी और उस मौजू पे थी कि मोहम्मद बिन कासिम जो है वो पहला सिटीज़न है पाकिस्तान का, जो ज़ियाउल हक के दौर में मैं मैट्रिक में था, 8वीं 9वीं क्लास में था, इसी शहर में लाहौर में, और मुझे रोज़ाना ये पढ़ाया जाता था मोहम्मद बिन कासिम के बारे में. बहुत शौकीन थी मेरे दोस्त वगैरह अहबाब, और मुझे गुस्सा आता था कि यार ये सीरियन kid, why is he being shoved down my throat? Like, why do I care about some Arab kid from, 800 years ago? Like, how is that relevant to my life? Little did I know then that it would take me a long time to figure out why that's relevant. So part of the reason this book exists and my previous books exist is because I'm interested in how history writing dictates our everyday life. And part of that is किताब के आखिर में I mention a lot of historians जो 1910, 20, 30 की दिहाई में लिख रहे हैं, medievalists. Or in 1935, at the first Indian Historical Congress, the historians, as a general group, unequivocally say that the subcontinent will be partitioned if we don't write to resist it. They know this is before 1940. Because they know what the logical consequences are of the ways in which the colonial state has organized people and past. This predates the actual even claim for separate electoral or political homes. And I think as historians, it's our duty to see how historical narratives are being used in the public sphere, in political ways, to demonize someone, to say that someone is special, deserves more rights than anyone else. These are arguments that are historical. And even in the claim that civilizationally we are different from someone else, even that claim is actually itself historical claim. It's a claim of 1400 years. It's not a claim of, I just moved into this neighborhood and I have nothing in common with anyone else that lives here.
बड़ा मज़ा आया आपका लेक्चर सुन के, मगर मैं पहले आपको ये बता दूं कि जो आपने बातें की हैं उसमें जो सबसे इम्पोर्टेंट बात थी, आपने बंदोबस्त मसूल का किया, वो शेरशाह सूरी, टोडरमल और अकबर के दरमियान है। दूसरा आपने जो इम्पोर्टेंट बात की महाभारत की, महाभारत को सब ने रिजेक्ट कर दिया। 800 साल के बाद एक अंधे पोइट ने वो किताब लिखी और अब साइंटिफिकली महाभारत की कोई हकीकत नहीं है। ये जितने भी आपके क्रिटिक्स हैं उन्होंने कंफर्म किया। तीसरी बात भक्ति मूवमेंट की है, आपने कहा कोई मूवमेंट नहीं हुई। इन्होंने बड़ी कोशिश की कि भक्ति मूवमेंट करके मुसलमान और हिंदू का तस्वर ख़त्म किया जाए। तो ये 4 बातें हैं, ये आप ज़रा आप एक्सप्लेन करें।
बहुत शुक्रिया।
आपने भी बात की पाकिस्तान और इंडिया की, और कि कुछ रियासतें कुछ क्लेम करती हैं कि हम मुख्तलिफ हैं। हमें ये नज़र आता है कि पाकिस्तान और इंडिया जब बने हैं तो एक मखसूस हिस्टोरिकल इवेंट से बने। अनलाइक से जापान विच इज़ अ जियोग्राफिकल नेशन और जर्मनी विच इज़ अ हिस्टोरिकल नेशन, ये एक इवेंट बेस्ड नेशन है। तो आपको लगता है कि जब कलोनियलिज्म हिस्ट्री में रिसीड करती चली जाएगी तो nations, colonial nations in Africa and like Pakistan are bound to perish? For example, Holy Roman Empire बड़े मखसूस events पे बनी थी, और जब वो events और उनके हालात और उनके narratives मर गए तो वो empire भी collapse कर गई। तो do you think that in a sense that जो even जो India भी claim करते हैं of greater India, that is historically inevitable because वो collapse आएगा ही आएगा? क्योंकि इसकी एक और अच्छी मिसाल है कि जब रशियन रेवोल्यूशन आया था तो ज़ार जो था वो 1917 रशियंस के लिए रेलेवेंट था, वो 1980s के रशियंस के लिए नहीं था। तो टू अपहोल्ड कम्युनिज्म, वेल दैट रियली डिडंट मैटर। जिस तरह आपने कहा व्हाई इज द सीरियन किड बीइंग शव्ड डाउन माय थ्रोट, व्हाई इज द ज़ार ऑफ रशिया बीइंग शव्ड डाउन द थ्रोट ऑफ 1980s रशियन। तो डू यू थिंक दैट इन द फ्यूचर लोग ये कहेंगे कि आपकी जो अंग्रेज़ों के खिलाफ मूवमेंट थी, व्हाई इज़ दैट बीइंग शव्ड डाउन माय थ्रोट? ठीक है, आपने 100 साल पहले 200 साल पहले किया होगा, बट अब तो कोई रेलेवेंस नहीं रही, एंड दैट माइट अशर इन अ कोलैप्स।
शुक्रिया। देखें, तकरीबन 20 साल पहले ये काफ़ी काफ़ी दानिश्वर यही कह रहे थे कि नेशन स्टेट जो है वो अपने आखिरी लेग्स पे है. ऐसा हुआ नहीं. Brexit, the kind of rise of authoritarianism, all these things have shown us that the nation state as an idea remains incredibly powerful. लेकिन उसका एक दूसरा मसला है, वो ये है कि हम लाहौर शहर में बैठे हुए हैं. अभी पैनल से पहले डॉक्टर साहब ने कहा था कि क्या बात है कि आज हमें आसमान नज़र आया है लाहौर में. All of the climate predictions that we have at the moment say that in 30 years from now, 30 years from this moment, not 300, just 30 years from this moment, there will be up to 300 million people who will be displaced, permanently displaced from exactly where we sit right now. Lahore, जिसकी तारीख पे मैं अभी किताब लिख रहा हूँ, which can claim for itself a 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 year old past, doesn't have a future in 30 years. So the question is that the nation state as an idea may be still very, very powerful. But our world is no longer powerful. We will not be able to breathe. We will not be able to drink water. We will drown here in South Asia, in subcontinent, in Pakistan, in India, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh. So that 30-year window, we need some other answer than any answer that I see anyone in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh being willing to offer.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर. सर मेरा सवाल ये है कि रिसेंटली मैं एक आर्टिकल पढ़ रहा था हु इन्वेंटेड हिंदुइज़्म, लोरेंजन का. तो उसमें वो एक आर्गूमेंट क्लेम करता है कि ये जो हिंदुइज़्म का जो आइडिया है इट वाज नॉट क्रिएटेड बाय कॉलोनियल एडमिनिस्ट्रेटर्स. तो उसमें एक लंबी सी वो लिस्ट देता है कि किन लोगों ने इस आइडिया के उलट एक आइडिया क्रिएट किया हुआ है, और वो जिम्मेदारी ठहराते हैं कि ये ब्रिटिश एडमिनिस्ट्रेटर्स ने ये आइडिया जो है वो कंस्ट्रक्ट किया है. तो इसको आप कहाँ पे लोकेट करते हैं? ये मेरा एक सवाल है.
Thank you so very much for all of your insights that you provided. I have traveled a lot. Most of the world, many countries. I have studied so many cultures. मेरा आपसे एक बिल्कुल बुनियादी सवाल ये बनता है कि कॉलोनिज़म आप लेते हैं, उसके बाद हमारा जितने मुसलमान इधर आए, मुग़ल बादशाह आए, और वो बाकी हमारा जो कल्चर था, जो हमारी उस वक्त इंडो पाक में आबादी थी, उसमें अगर हम देखा जाए तो फरिश्ता कैसे इस चीज़ को डिपेक्ट करता है कि तमाम लीडर जो पिछले 400-500 ईयर्स के थे, दे वर सो डम्ब, या आप इस तरह देख लें कि वो कोई आर्ट में या डांसेस में लगे रहे, जबकि वेस्ट उस वक्त रिसर्चेस कर रहा था, और वेस्ट वाज डूइंग लॉट ऑफ स्टफ फॉर ह्यूमैनिटी, जबकि हम जस्ट भेड़ बकरियां थे और आबादी बढ़ती जा रही थी, एंड वी डिड नथिंग फॉर ईच अदर. इसको फरिश्ता कैसे देखता है? इसको आप किस एंगल से आपने इसको डिपेक्ट किया इसमें? जी,
Lorenzen का argument, invention of Hinduism, it's you know 90s के अंदर this was a very important argument. आजकल I think जो लोग इस मौजू पे काम कर रहे हैं वो उनको दो तरह से देखते हैं. वो एक तरह से देखते हैं कि हिंदुइज़म एज अ प्रीसेप्ट, जिसके अंदर भगवत गीता और महाभारत एक तरह के कैनोनिकल टेक्स्ट हैं, और मनुस्मृति एक तरह की लीगल कोड है, और कास्ट एक तरह की काइंड ऑफ कॉडिफाइड सोशल कॉन्डक्ट है. ये सब चीज़ें वाकई में कॉलोनियलिज्म के ज़रिए इंस्टीट्यूशनलाइज हुई हैं. और अगर हम हिंदुइज़म को उस लिहाज से डिफ़ाइन करेंगे तो फिर उसको हम कह सकते हैं कि हिंदुइज़म की इन्वेंशन इस टाइम पीरियड पे होगी। इसके ख़िलाफ़ अदर जो स्कॉलर्स हैं वो कहते हैं कि आप किसी भी रिलीजन को आप उनकी बुनियादी किताबों या लॉज के ज़रिए डिफ़ाइन नहीं कर सकते, कोई भी रिलीजन हो। और अगर हम उसको उस रिलीजन को उसकी सोशल और रिचुअल प्रैक्टिसेस के ज़रिए देखेंगे तो वो फिर आपकी कहानी जहाँ भी जाए वो कलोनियलिज्म से पहले की कहानी हो सकती है। लेकिन इस बात में कोई शक व शुबा नहीं है कि हमारी ज़ुबान में अपनी अखिलियाती ज़ुबान की बात कर रहा हूँ, आइडियोलॉजिकल लैंग्वेज इज़ शेप्ड by colonialism. So there is no out of it in a sense until Fanon gives us the purifying the cleansing power of fire. So until we do that, बाकी भाई साइंस या फलाह ये किसी भी माशरे, किसी भी टाइम पीरियड में किसी एक तबके या नस्ल या ज़ात या नेशन की नहीं है। इस पे किसी का सोल हक नहीं है। हम सब इंसान जहाँ भी हैं, हम सब ने एक दूसरे के लिए काम किया है, हम सब ने रिसर्च किया है, हम सब ने चीज़ें बनाई हैं। सो
चलिए, बहुत शुक्रिया और वंस अगेन थैंक यू वेरी मच प्रोफेसर मनान आसिफ फॉर राइटिंग।
बहुत शुक्रिया।
And this book is available here. A local Pakistani edition of the book is available at the bookstall. Thank you.
Okay everyone, we have a 10-minute break, and after this the next session will be on the topic Triumph and Disappear.